Good evening, everyone. Myself, Manju Verma, Assistant Professor, Department of MCA from IIMT College of Engineering, Greater Noida. I'm going to deliver the lecture on Introduction to Servlet. This is the topic related to Java programming as well as the web tech subject, web technology subject, is of your which is mentioned in your syllabus. So now. So what is servlet? Servlet actually is the technology which is used to create a web application. It is actually a server-side programming language. Before Servlet, CGI, Common Gateway Interface, is the scripting language or the server-side programming language. There are some common problems in the CGI. So the next, the technology which is used for server-side programming language is used as the servlet technology. So servlet technology is robust and scalable because of Java language, because it is written in the Java language. That is why it is the robust and scalable, because as the Java is the platform independent language. Before Servlet, CGI, as I told you, the scripting language was common as the server-side programming language. There are many interfaces and classes in the Servlet APIs, such as Servlet, GenericServlet, HttpServlet, the Servlet request, and Servlet response. So now, first of all, what is the Servlet? I'm talking about the Servlet. So the question comes in mind that what is the servlet? So what is the task of the servlet? What is the role of servlet in the server side programming? So the main role of servlet is to process the request sent by the user and then generate its response and send the response to the client uh, of the request. So that is the main role of the servlet. So servlet can be described in many ways depending on the context. These are some common ways. These are the ways in which servlet can be described. The first one is servlet is a technology which is used to create a web application. The first way to describe is the actually is the servlet is the web application. Servlet is an API that provides many interfaces and classes, including documentation. Servlet is an interface that must be implemented for creating any servlet. Servlet is a class that extends the capabilities of the servers and responds to the incoming requests. It can respond to any request. The meaning of that it can process any request is that it can handle any type of request, not only the HTTP request only, it can handle any type of request. So the servlet actually provides the capability to servers to respond to the incoming requests. Servlet is a web component that is deployed on the server to create a dynamic web page. There is the whole concept of the servlet. Whenever there is a client and a server, whenever a client sends a request to server, the role of servlet starts at the server side. The servlet generates, process that request, generates their response from the database and send that response to the client. So there is a three-step process each servlet can perform, have to perform. So first of all, when the client send the request to server, and then at the server side, servlet provides servlet generates the request response to that request and send this response to the client. Now, what is common gateway interface? What is the problems that are in the CGI so that the need of servlet arises? So we learn about it. So CGI is the technology enables the web server to call an external program and pass HTTP request information to the external program to process the request. For each request, it starts a new process. The main problem is only that it starts a new process whenever the request generates. For each request, it generates a new process. That is the time consuming as well as the memory consuming process, because each process consumes lots of memory as well as lots of time to process. So this CGI has that problem that this is starts a new process with each request. Here are some disadvantages with the CGI. So if the number of clients increases, it takes more time for sending the response. Obviously, if the number of clients increases, the number of processes also increases. If the number of processes increases, it will take more time to handle each process and generate response and send the response back to the user. So it is obviously time consuming process. The next one is for each request, it starts a process and a web server is limited to start processes. It uses platform dependent language, for example, C, C++, Perl. So it is also a platform dependent because it is not written in the platform independent language. It is written in C, C++, so that is why it is not a platform independent as just as the servlet. Now, talking about the advantages of servlet. What are the advantages of servlet? So, over the CGI, I'm talking about over the CGI only. The advantages of servlet. Like the CGI, the whenever a request sent by a client, CGI only every time it generates a new process. But in the servlet, for each request, there is only one process, and for each request, it is created a new thread for each request. But the process is just one for each request. So it is creating only one process for each request, while in CGI it is CGI creates a new process for each request. So there is the this is the main difference between the CGI or and the servlet. I can say that because in CGI, whenever any request a process request comes from the user or the client, it creates a new process. While in servlet, whenever a user sends a request, it creates only one process, and for each request it creates a new thread. So it encounters a thread process in the servlet. So that is why it is not a time consuming as well as the memory saving process. So that is the main advantage of servlet. One more advantage is that it is written in Java so that it is also a platform independent, but CGI is not a platform independent because of it is not written in Java, it is written in C, C++ or Perl language. So that is one more advantage of servlet over CGI. And also because it is uh, creating only one process, so it is also not time consuming at all, and also saving the memory. So here I'm writing the advantages. So there are many advantages of servlet over CGI. The web container creates threads for handling the multiple requests to the servlet. Threads have many benefits over the processes, as I told you earlier, such as they share a common memory area. Just because of that, it is memory saving a process, and it is lightweight. Cost of communication between the threads are also low, and the advantages of servlet are as follows. It provides better performance because it creates a thread for each process, not process only. The portability, because it uses Java language, so it is also a portable. You can copy and paste your code anywhere, so that is why it is platform independent or portable. Robust, JVA manages servlets, so we don't need to worry about the memory leak or garbage collection. And it is secure because it is uses Java language. Once again, it is secure also because Java language is automatically provides it safe security. Now next, the servlet architecture. So there are two types of servlets, generic servlets and HTTP servlets. And there are three potential ways in which we can employ to create a servlet. First of all, the types of servlets. These two are the servlets. Uh, First of all, I'm talking about the HTTP servlets. HTTP servlets are can only be handled the only requests which are the HTTP requests. It can only handle HTTP requests, while generic servlets can handle any type of request. This is the main difference between these two servlets, two types of servlets. HTTP servlets only handle the HTTP requests, while generic servlets can handle any type of requests. So there are three ways we can employ to create a servlet: implementing servlet interface, extending generic servlet, and extending HTTP servlet. Here is the component of servlet architecture. Here you can see that there is a web browser and web server, and the third one is the servlet container. Whenever the web browser from the web browser request generates to the web server, the task of servlet is to process this request through the container, servlet container. Here you can see that there are two servlets. There can be more than two servlets as per your request or as per your requirement. So there can be more than one servlet or two servlets. Any number of servlets can be in the servlet container. The request is processed through the servlet and through database, and response is generated through the servlet from the database, and then response goes back to the web server, and then from the web server to the web browser. This is the whole scenario or whole architecture of the servlet. So here's the client, number one client, and number two web server. What is client? The client shown in the architecture above is primarily working as the medium who is the sending out HTTP request over to the web server, and again processing the request it gets back from the server. As we can see in the diagram, a client here is the web browser. Web server The primary job of a web server is to process the requests and responses that a user sends over time and maintain how a web user would be able to access the files that has been hosted over the server. The server we are talking about here is a software which manages access to a centralized resource of service in a network. There are precisely two types of web servers: static web servers and dynamic web servers. Static web servers are those servers that are already fixed. So these are known as the static web servers, and dynamic web servers in which you can change at the dynamic time or runtime. These type of servers are known as the dynamic web server. The third one is web container. Web container is the component of the servlet. So web container is another typical component in servlet architecture, which is responsible for communicating with the servlets. Two prime tasks of web container are managing the servlet lifecycle URL mapping, and web container sits at the server side managing and handling all the requests that are coming in either from the servlets or from some JSP pages or potentially any other file system. So now coming to know about how the servlet works. So every servlet should override the following three methods, namely init, service, and destroy. These three methods are used to process the request from the user. See, whenever a request generates, all the three methods comes into process. First one is init, that is initiates the request. The next one is init initiates the servlet, and the service, that is process the request and generate the response. And last one is destroy, which is used to destroy the servlet at the end of the response generates and send it back to the user. These are the steps in which a request flows through a servlet. The first step, the client sends over a request. The request is accepted by the web server and forwarded to the web container. In order to obtain the servlet's address, the web container traces web.xml file corresponding to the request URL pattern. By the time above process takes place, the servlet should have been instantiated and initialized. If the servlet has not been instantiated and initialized, init method is invoked to serve the process. By passing servlet request and response object, public service method is called by the container. So first of all, the request is whenever a request sent by the user, it is accepted by the web server and then send that to the web container of servlet. In order to obtain the servlet's address, the task of web container to create the web.xml file, which is the main file in the servlet, which is used to deploy the main the servlet. By the time being, the servlet should have been instantiated and initialized through the init method. The first method, init method, is invoked to serve the purpose, and then after that, service method is initiated for process the request and generating the response. In the next step, the servlet request and servlet response objects are typecasted to HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response objects by the public service method. These methods are used for the security purpose to provide it the main protocols for HTTP protocols. And now protected service method is called by the public service method. The protected service method dispatches the request to the correct handler method based on the type of the request. Which type of, if the request is of HTTP request or the generic request, depending on the, it will only depending on the type of request. When servlet container shuts down, it unloads all the servlets and calls destroy methods for each initialized servlet. Whenever the request is processed and the response is generated and send the response to the user, after that the task of servlet is completed. The last method, destroy method, is invoked to destroy or to end up the servlet. So these are the steps to be followed whenever we are initiating or creating any servlet. So now the servlet interface. Servlet interface provides common behavior to all the servlets. Servlet interface defines methods that all servlets must implement. All the servlets must have been must be implemented whenever the servlet is initiated. Servlet interface needs to be implemented for creating any servlet. It provides three lifecycle methods that are used to initialize the servlet, to request the servlet request, and to destroy the servlet, and two non-lifecycle methods. So methods of servlet interface. These are the 5 methods of servlets in the servlet lifecycle. First 3 methods are the servlet lifecycle method, and the last 2 methods are non-lifecycle methods. First method is public void init servlet config. That method initialized the servlet. It is the life cycle method of servlet, and it is invoked by the web container only once. Whenever any request sent by the user or by the client, first time this method is invoked in the life cycle of a servlet until that request is processed. After that, next method, public void service, servlet request, servlet response method is created. That method provides response for the incoming request. It is invoked at each request by the web container. This method is also invoked only once whenever a request is initiated or sent by the user. And the public void destroy, third method, this method is invoked only once and indicates that servlet is being destroyed. Whenever the response get back to the user and the process is completed, after that message is invoked to end up the servlet, to destroy the servlet, actually you can say that. So these 3 methods are the life cycle methods, and the last 2 methods, public servlet config, get servlet config. That method actually returns the object of servlet config. Servlet config method का जो है, that is created a object of that particular class, that particular servlet config class. It is created an object of that. Uh, the next method, public string get servlet info. That that method provides that returns information about the servlet such as writer, copyright, version, etc. That these two methods are non-lifecycle methods because you can invoke any number of times in between init and destroy method. You can call these two methods, and these methods are non-life cycle methods. So here is all about the methods of servlet interface. Now we are showing here you an example of servlet. Here we are implementing servlet interface. We have imported a java.io class, a javax.servlet class, and then here you can see that we initialize it with the method servlet config is equal to null. Then we start with the first method, init method. The servlet is initiated first time. After that, the service method, public void service, servlet request, and servlet response. And we'll also add up here the exception. So first method is init method, you can see here, and the service method to process the request. And the last method, here is the process of that request, generating the response and send the response to the uh, client. And after that, public void destroy method is called upon, and we print here servlet is destroyed. The last two methods I am showing here, that is public servlet config, get servlet config, that returns the configuration that created an object of that, and the last one giving you the it will return the information about that servlet. Now the generic servlet class. So what is the generic servlet class? Generic servlet class that implements the servlet config, and serializable interfaces. It provides the implementation of all the methods of these interfaces except the service method. Generic servlet class can handle any type of request, so it is protocol independent. As I told you earlier, in this generic servlet type, it is not only the protocol dependent, that is not only the HTTP protocol dependent, it will provide you any type of request it can handle. Also the protocol independent request it can handle. You may create a generic servlet by inheriting the generic servlet class and providing the implementation of the service method. It will handle any type of request. The main difference with the generic servlet class and of the generic, I can say that the HTTP servlet is main difference between these two are the of the protocol only. HTTP servlet provides only, it can process only the HTTP requests, while generic servlet can handle any type of request, also of which is not of protocol dependent, or I can say that it can handle any type of request, so it is also the protocol independent. These are the methods of generic servlet class. These are the methods of generic servlet class. The first one is public void init, same as the HTTP request. Only difference between the generic servlet and the HTTP servlet method, it will add up HTTP also with the method name. So public void init, that is used to initialize the servlet. The service method, which is provide service for the incoming request, it is invoked at each time when user request for a servlet. Again, the destroy method is invoked only once throughout the life cycle and indicates that servlet is being destroyed. Next method, public servlet config, get servlet config. That particular method returns the object of servlet config like previous one, and the public string get servlet info that returns information about servlet such as writer, copyright, version, etc. Public void init, it is a convenient method for the servlet programmers. Now there is no need to call super.init config. Some more methods over here in the generic servlet class. These are the servlet context, get servlet context. This returns the object of servlet context, and the get init parameter that returns the parameter value for the given parameter name. The next method, public enumeration get init parameter names, that returns all the parameters defined in the web XML file. Okay, thank you so much.